Chapter 10. Perhaps because of the nature of his work and the problems of his students, Gurdjieff often discoursed on the question of good and evil. Basically, as he frequently pointed out, there are no such things as good and evil except as they exist in the form of moral concepts in the mind of man. But since his work dealt with mankind, and since mankind individually was preoccupied with both good and evil, they did therefore exist as problems in the sense that if one believes that something exists, it does exist. In this sense, mind is reality. In an objective sense, Gurdjieff preferred what he called objective morality, a morality based on individual conscience and not on any social definitions of good and evil. In this sense, evil could be considered a term for whatever was improper to man as a function of his manifestation, anything that harmed an individual or his fellow men. In this limited sense, i.e., that good and evil exist if you think they do, Gurdjieff insisted that man's potentiality to manifest either good or evil was always equally strong and that it, in fact, grew as man learned more and developed more. While I had often heard arguments against his theory, it seems simple and logical enough to me. As man learns and grows, his general potential and his power increases. It seems natural, therefore, that if one subscribes to moral concepts defined by the words good and evil, a man's potentiality to act in either sense is automatically increased. Surely Hitler and Stalin, together with millions of their followers, were convinced that their aims, and therefore their means of achieving them, were good. A good deal of misunderstanding entered into any discussions on this subject, largely because it is difficult for any large group of individuals to define what is good and what is evil, and then to agree on such definitions. It seems to me that when Gurdjieff used the terms he was using It seems to me that when Gurdjieff used the terms he was using them in a special and rather narrow sense, referring to the constructive and destructive forces in man as related to his own growth and development. For example, he frequently warned that his work could only become more difficult as one learned more. In other words, as one grew, one did not achieve any greater peace or any visible or tangible reward. One did not become obviously good, but the struggle between any individual's capacity for good or evil for himself became that much more intensified. Mr. Gurdjieff himself was an interesting example of this particular theory, and I often thought that his personal power was such that he could very easily do as much harm as he could do good. When he advised a woman to give up her very well-paid position and incur debts in order to rid herself finally of her preoccupation with final security, there were many people who thought this was evil advice, as there were those also who thought it good. It depended finally upon the interpretation given to the advice by the woman in question and the effect it had on her. Incidentally, she followed his advice and had to struggle for years to get out of debt. She thought it was an experience that contributed to her growth and understanding of life and of people, as well as something that did free her from her unconscious involvement with security. Because of the effect of Gurdjieff, the impact of his presence on people, it was necessary for him to exercise a great deal of judgment in his dealing with them, particularly since most people came to him with a preconceived idea of his abilities and his teachings. Such preconceptions were usually not founded on any truth or fact, and were only likely to be increased once the person concerned had actually met him. Because of his reputation, people rarely met an individual named Gurdjieff. They met a picture of him that had previously formed in their minds. A person who was convinced that Gurdjieff was dealing in evil black magic, on meeting him, would interpret anything he might say or do as proof that he was a black magician. Many years ago, Aleister Crowley, who had made a name for himself in England as a magician, and who boasted, among other things, of having suspended his pregnant wife by her thumbs in an effort to produce a monster child, made an unsolicited visit to Gurdjieff in Fontainebleau. Crowley was apparently convinced that Gurdjieff was a black magician, and the ostensible purpose of his visit was to challenge Gurdjieff in some sort of duel in magic. The visit turned out to be anticlimactical, as Gurdjieff although he would not deny his knowledge of certain powers that might be called magic, refused to demonstrate any of them. In his turn, Mr. Crowley also refused to reveal any of his powers, so, to the great disappointment of the onlookers, we did not witness any supernatural feats. Also, Mr. Crowley departed with the impression that Gurdjieff was either a fake, or B, an inferior black magician. Gurdjieff did not use the terms good and evil in a rather simple Gurdjieff did use the terms good and evil in a rather simple, direct sense when he said that it was evil for a man not to honor his parents, that a good man of necessity did honor them. I think also that he would have classified murder as evil, but beyond such obvious examples he made no pronouncements one way or the other. Certainly a great part of his teaching was an attempt to help his students rid themselves of the ordinary concepts moral of both good and evil, and to replace their ordinary morality with an objective morality based upon the needs and dictates of conscience, and that which was proper and natural to individual men. He insisted, however, that it was necessary to live one's life fully within the framework of society, and that in order to do this and not be conspicuous, one had to subscribe, in public at least, to the prevailing social morality. In other words, it was necessary to act out one's role on the stage of life, but always to be able to differentiate between the outer acting man and the inner real man. He said that it was extremely difficult for anyone to do this properly, since the differentiation was often difficult to make. Most people acted out their lives under the impression that they were living, when they were in fact only reacting to life as it happened to them. He stated that, contrary to the principles expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, as it was frequently interpreted, it was necessary to hide one's light from the ignorant and the uninitiated, as they would only, quite automatically, attempt to destroy any such light or knowledge. However, it was equally important not to hide that same knowledge or light from oneself and from others who were working seriously and honestly towards the same goals of self-development and proper growth.